Good morning, friends. Good to be here with you together today. New friends, old friends, everybody in between, in the room, online. Merry Christmas. It's getting close. It's always amazing how quickly we get to the end of Advent, the celebration of Christmas. I hope your celebrations are already going well for you and your family, your friends, and I hope you have a blessed week this week. Hope to see you all back here in just a few days for our Christmas Eve services as we celebrate together. So we are coming to the end of this series that we've been in, and we're calling it The King is Here. We made the point a few weeks ago that it's not the King was here and then went away somewhere else. No, when Jesus came to be born into the world, even when he lived his ministry and went back to the Father in heaven, he left his Spirit so that he is here. When we celebrate the birth of Jesus, we're celebrating the King who is here among us and wants to do things in our lives, in our families, in our church, in our community. And so that's what we want to lean into as we listen and pay attention to the King through this Advent season. If you've been with us, we've seen in the first couple of chapters of Matthew how Jesus is the Messiah. One of his titles meant he was the anointed king promised all throughout the Old Testament. Jesus is the Savior. We read that passage in worship this morning. He came to save us from our sins by being our sacrifice and by also bringing his presence through his Spirit. He is Emmanuel, God with us. We've seen how Jesus is the ruler. He's the one who has all authority, but he leads us with compassion and care. He exercises his rule with the loving care of God the Father. And we're going to see today another title of Jesus, another designation of who he is, and that is that Jesus is the Son. Jesus is the Son of God. Now that is a very familiar designation of Jesus, but there's a meaning to it that may surprise you as we think about what it means that Jesus is the Son of God. And to set up where we're going with this, I want to ask a question about the way that we live our lives and the voices that we listen to in our lives. So who do you listen to? We all listen to stuff all the time, don't we? This got me thinking about who I listen to, and I'm always listening to something or reading something, whether I'm driving around in the car or working or at home. It seems like there's always something going on. So for me, I listen to a lot of podcasts for pastors and leaders. So if I'm driving around, chances are I'm listening to somebody talk about what it's like to be a pastor or something about leadership. I also read a fair bit of Bible commentaries about things that pertain to teaching and preaching. So those are some voices that I listen to as well. I also got to confess, I listen to a lot of content aimed at husbands and fathers who are in their 40s and 50s, right? So a lot of content to encourage me out of my bad habits and to inspire me toward better habits. So that's a lot of the content that I consume and I listen to, especially on social media. I also listen to a fair bit of news. I get my news from sources that try to avoid the polarizing rhetoric of either end of the political spectrum, but try to balance and help navigate the complexities of the world that we live in. So that's who I listen to. Why do I listen to those things? Well, because each of those is a part of the story that I'm living. So I'm a pretty typical pastor of a church, husband and father, who's 49 years old, raising a family in a first world context, trying to make sense of what's going on in the world. Like, I'm not alone in that, right? There are others like me. There are others who are my type who probably listen to much of the same things I listen to. And as I've been thinking about this, it occurs to me that the stories that we're connected to, that we identify with, that's really what drives what we listen to, doesn't it? Which leads to a second question. Not only who do you listen to, but what stories are you connected to? What's your type? And does that drive what you listen to? So maybe your story is one of an educator or a sports fan or a business person, maybe a foodie. Maybe you're a 32-year-old wife and mother. Maybe you're a 20-year-old emerging adult. Maybe you're a 16-year-old high school student. Whoever you are and whatever you identify with, whatever your story is, is probably driving most of what you listen to, isn't it? So I wonder, what story do you connect with? What's your type? And what do you listen to? Who do you watch? Who do you follow? Who shows up on your feed when you consume the content that's coming your way? Whatever it is, it not only connects you to that bigger story, but it shapes your individual story as well. And if you're a Christian, if you're a follower of Jesus, then part of your story is that you're connected to something much bigger than who you are individually. Your story is connected to a much bigger story, and I wonder how much that shapes what you're listening to, how you live your life. As we get into this next scene in the birth story of Jesus, the gospel writer Matthew goes to great lengths, and you're going to see this as we unpack this over the next few minutes. He goes to great lengths to show us how the birth story of Jesus is connected to the bigger story of what God is doing throughout history. Not only history that came before Jesus, but history that comes all the way forward to you and me. And we're going to see three ways this morning that the birth story of Jesus is connected to a bigger story of how God works in the world and what that means for you and me and the stories that we're connected to, and specifically what that means for who we listen to and how we're shaped on a daily basis. So we're going to go to Matthew chapter 2. This next scene is going to unfold for us three ways that Jesus' birth narrative connects us to the bigger story. And the first thing I want us to see is this. First way, Jesus' birth story connects us to the bigger story of what God is doing. And it's this: God protects his children by leading them to safety. One of the things that God is doing in the story that he's writing in the world is that he is protecting his children by leading them to safety. And we're going to see how he does this in the birth story of Jesus. So it picks up in verse 13, and it says this: when they had gone, that is a reference to the Magi, the wise men, when they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So we saw last week how these Magi, the wise men, came to Herod and they're asking, where is this new king going to be born? Well, that freaked out Herod. We saw that. He's a paranoid, ruthless king. And we got a sense in the scene last week that he's going to want to snuff out this new king. Well, now it becomes obvious. Like, okay, Herod was going to plot to kill Jesus. And so that's what's unique in the story. There is a sitting king in the province where Jesus was born that wanted to kill Jesus. That's a unique part of Jesus' birth story. But even that connects us to something that's bigger. It connects us to something that God does throughout history in his bigger story, and he certainly did it for Jesus, Joseph, and Mary, and that is this protection. God guides and protects his children by leading them to safety. And so the Magi had gone back a different way for their safety. He led them. We saw it at the end of the scene last week. They didn't go back through Jerusalem by Herod. No, God redirected them, protecting them for their safety. And here is the second time that an angel appears to Joseph in Matthew's story. A couple weeks ago, we saw the first time. This is the third time that God has guided his people through a dream. So throughout this story, we see evidence of God protecting his children by leading them to safety. This is now 2 times he's redirected his people. He redirected the Magi for their safety. Now he's redirecting Jesus and Joseph and Mary as he's guiding them. But he's doing it in a really unique way. The way that God is guiding and protecting Jesus, Joseph, and Mary is by leading them on an escape route to Egypt. Now that's interesting. That might surprise you. You know, if you've heard stories of the Bible, and in fact it comes up a lot in our study of the Bible here, Egypt is a great theme in the Bible, in the Old Testament in particular, and it speaks to the time when for 430 years the Israelites were in Egypt, and a large portion of that time they were under oppression and slavery. And so the great exodus that we read about in the Old Testament is God delivering his people out of the oppressive slavery in Egypt. So that's what, for most of us, I think comes to mind when we think about Egypt, a place of slavery and oppression. And yet here, God guides and protects the child Jesus and Joseph and Mary by leading them to Egypt, to escape to Egypt for safety. Well, that's interesting. That might surprise you, that Egypt would be a place of safety. So it's interesting. Egypt sort of plays this double role in Israel's history. Because if you remember all the way back, how Israel got into Egypt in the first place. So there was a famine in Abraham's day and his sons. And it came down to Jacob, Abraham's grandson, and there was a famine in the land, and they had to find food somewhere. And you know where food was? It's where Jacob's son Joseph had risen to power in Egypt. And so Egypt started off as a place of safety. And in fact, because Joseph was so well known in Egypt, I mean, they were treated like kings. Egypt was originally this place of great safety and refuge. Well, over time, a Pharaoh rose up. We read about it in Exodus chapter 1, who didn't remember Joseph, and he just saw this growing nation of Israelites as a threat, and so he started to oppress them. So what started off as a place of refuge and safety became a place of oppression and slavery. Well, over the years, the proximity of Egypt to Israel provided an opportunity for safety at various times. So historians who write about Israel's history, stuff that doesn't show up in the Bible, but early Jewish historians talk about over the years when there was trouble in Palestine, when there was trouble in Israel, whether it was a famine or a ruler like Herod who was causing trouble and the people needed to flee, they could go about 75 miles to the south, and they could go to a Roman province in this day that was led by somebody other than Herod. And historians tell us that there were about 1 million Jews living in Egypt, just in a different province of the Roman Empire. And in times like the day of Jesus' birth, when there was a threat in Israel, they could escape to Egypt and find refuge. So Egypt sort of plays this interesting double role there. And God says to them through the angel, he says, "Stay there until I tell you." And it sort of foreshadows that this is not ultimate. They're not relocating permanently. There's going to be a time when they're going to be led back, but until that time comes, they're to stay there in Egypt until he would speak to them again. So he protected his children by leading them to a place of safety, even an unlikely place of safety. And I think it connects us to the bigger story, because that's not the only time that God protects his children by leading them to a place of safety. He's done it throughout history, and he continues to do it today. And so as we ask the question, like, what stories are we connected to? I wonder, do you see that as your story? Do you see how God has led you to a place of safety, perhaps in the past, through some circumstance that was threatening or difficult, and God worked in your life to bring you to a place of safety and refuge, stability, security? How might he be working in your life right now? If you're in a place that doesn't feel secure or safe, how might God be leading you to a place of safety? Because this is part of what God does in his bigger story. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to make life easy, right? Imagine a 75-mile walk with a 2-year-old in the middle of the night, you know? So, it's not like it's going to be all that easy, but if you're a child of God, then you're part of a bigger story that defines your story. And one aspect of it is that this is what God does. He protects his children by leading us to places of safety. Well, the story continues, and it leads us to a second way that Jesus' birth narrative connects us to a bigger story that God is writing, and it's this. Not only does God protect his children by leading them to places of safety, but secondly, God speaks to his children through his firstborn son. God speaks to his children through his firstborn son. And we're going to see how this gets there beginning in verse 14. It says, so he got up, that is Joseph, after he had heard from the angel in the dream. He got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son. So what's unique in the birth story here? Well, we see Joseph's obedience, right away. So this is the second time in the story that an angel appears to Joseph, and Joseph does exactly what the angel tells him to do. Like word for word, almost exactly, Joseph carries out. He obeys willingly and immediately what God speaks to him through the angel. And in this case, during the night, he obeyed and got up and left. And so it tells us about some of the urgency and the need for cover in getting up and going through the night. And it's interesting as you think about the timeline of when this might have been. This could have been, and likely was, the very same night that the Magi had come with their gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. So if you kind of roll back the story a little bit and remember where we've been, these Magi came into Jerusalem. They found a hearing with Herod, and Herod asked them where the child was going to be born. Found out from the religious leaders it's going to be in Bethlehem, and so Herod sends the wise men down to Bethlehem to kind of spy it out. You remember that? So if that happened even as late as mid to late afternoon or even early evening, and the Magi left, Bethlehem was about 5 miles south of Jerusalem. So if they're, walking from Jerusalem down to Bethlehem at a clip of even 20 to 30 minutes a mile, maybe this is a 2.5, 3-hour walk. They got an entourage with them. They got, the camels and all the things. Maybe it's a 4-hour walk. But it would have been very natural for these wise men, these Magi, to make it from their conversation with Herod to actually finding the child in Bethlehem as they follow the star, sometime in maybe the late evening there in Bethlehem. And of course, they worshiped him. We saw that last week. They presented their gifts, gold, frankincense, myrrh. You got to think they stayed at least a little while after coming all the way from the east. But let's say they stayed until midnight or 1 a.m. and they're worshiping and they're celebrating with Joseph and Mary. But at some point, it's like, okay, the baby's got to get some sleep. Mom's got to go to bed. So you imagine the Magi leave, 12, 1 in the morning perhaps. This isn't in the Bible. This is just what could have been based on the timelines of what it was. And so imagine they get off to sleep, and pretty soon after Joseph falls asleep, here comes this angel. And he says, Joseph, get up, because Herod is about to come, because he's seeking to kill the child. Remember what we know about Herod. He's this paranoid, neurotic king that here's this newborn, and he wants to snuff out that threat. And imagine, he doesn't hear back from the Magi for 10, 12 hours. He's going to start to get antsy, and he's going to want to send out, his people to get that newborn king, that child. And so it's entirely possible that it was that same evening that this angel appeared to Joseph and said, Joseph, get up. And he was leading him to safety. But that unique experience actually also connects us to what God does in his bigger story. And he does it in a very specific way. Matthew calls out, wants us to notice how this birth story, what God is doing, how he's speaking to his children to lead them to safety, is connected to a bigger story of how God has worked in history and how God does work. And he clues us into it through the words of this prophecy that says, out of Egypt I have called my son. Now, this is a quotation of Hosea 11:1. Hosea was a prophet in Israel. You can read about it in the Old Testament. And Hosea 11:1 says this, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. So in the prophet Hosea, this is a clear reference to the nation of Israel, and they were called out of Egypt when they were enslaved all those generations ago. And in that quotation, he references the nation of Israel as God's son. So when God is speaking through Hosea, he's saying that nation, Israel, that's my son, and I called my son out of Egypt. Well, that's interesting. That's unexpected, and there's a lot in that. So we're going to kind of work our way backwards through this prophecy, starting with son, and then kind of seeing the other pieces as they go. So there's a lot in this designation as son. Well, it goes all the way back to Exodus chapter 4, and this is the conversation that God was having with Moses when he was going to send them in before Pharaoh, when Moses was going to say, let my people go, right? That's a famous scene. So when God is calling Moses to go and deliver his people out of Egypt, this is the conversation, a piece of it, that God and Moses had. God tells Moses, then say to Pharaoh, this is what the Lord says. Israel is my firstborn son. And I told you, let my son go, so he may worship me. So what Matthew is helping us to see is that Jesus is not only the son of David as the Messiah in his genealogy. Jesus is not only the son of Abraham, all the way back the child of the promise, but Jesus is in fact the Son of God himself. And what that uniquely means, this connection to Israel's history, is that Jesus is God's firstborn son. Now that's significant too, because in the biblical context, the firstborn son was the representative of the father, the representative of the family, and the heir of everything that the father possessed. And so the firstborn son was this key role in the family as the representative of the father. And as God's son, we learn that Jesus is the true embodiment of everything that Israel was originally called to be as the firstborn son of God. God raised up Israel to represent him in the world. Remember the promise to Abraham, through your descendants, all nations of the world will be blessed. And so there was this calling on this nation to represent God in the world and to be the heir of all the things that God possesses. But of course, Israel didn't fulfill that role perfectly. Sometimes they did okay, but they failed a lot. And so here comes Jesus, and he takes on this identity as the firstborn son. He's the true Israel, the true firstborn son, and he's the one who embodies and brings to fruition all the things that God had originally called the nation of Israel to. This is Jesus as the firstborn son. And this is what the Gospels want us to see, especially Matthew, but all of the Gospel writers. This is the first reference in Matthew's Gospel that Jesus is God's son, but it's certainly not the last. Like throughout the Gospel, he goes to great lengths to show us connections between the ministry of Jesus and the history of Israel. For example, pretty soon after this story, we're going to meet a grown-up Jesus who's beginning his ministry, and he's going to go out into the wilderness, and he's going to fast for 40 days, which for anybody who knows anything about the early history of Israel, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And so there's a connection to what Jesus is doing to what has gone before. Other gospel writers do this too. John talks about a prophecy in Isaiah where God speaks of Israel as the vine that he delights in. And then in John 15, we hear Jesus saying, I am the true vine, and God is the gardener. And so over and over again, I could give a lot of examples of how the gospel writers connect what Jesus is doing as the Son of God to be the fulfillment, the perfect representation of what Israel did and was called to do. But where Israel ultimately failed to represent God well, Jesus represents him perfectly. So this is Jesus, the firstborn Son of God. But what we see in the prophecy, what Matthew wants us to see, is that that son was called out of Egypt. He was called out of Egypt. And so he led Joseph and Mary and Jesus into Egypt as that place of escape, but he didn't leave them there. He was going to call them back out, which is interesting. So you think about Israel's history. God led them into Egypt as a place of safety to protect them. But then when Egypt became a place of slavery and oppression, he led them out to protect them. So God led them in order to lead them out. And that leading out is a picture of salvation and deliverance and redemption. And so much of our theology of salvation comes from that deliverance of God out. And he did the very same thing with Jesus here in the birth narrative. He led him into Egypt so that he might call him out. He is that firstborn son. He brought Jesus in order to bring him out. Now, there is a lot of interesting stuff that we could get into. There's a lot of content out there that you could consume that points to so many connections between Jesus and Israel, Jesus and Moses as the leader of Israel. One of them in particular, a lot of you I know like to listen to the Bible Project videos that are really helpful summaries of Bible books and things like that. Tim Mackey, who leads the Bible Project, does a teaching series on Matthew, and he just does a really helpful job of holding up lots of details in Matthew's account in particular and the book of Exodus. And over and over and over again, there are phrases and allusions that go back. So there's a ton of interesting stuff there that we could get into. But there's one thing that started to occur to me as I was studying this and thinking about it, reflecting on it. And it's that Egypt seems to play this double role in the plan of God, in the history of Israel, and also in our lives and in the ministry of Jesus. Egypt seems to be this place that's a combination. Sometimes it's a haven, but also it can be a place of slavery and oppression. It's a mix of good and evil. And in that way, I think Egypt kind of represents the world that we live in. Right? There's a lot of good in it. There's a lot of good in the world that God has created and allows us to live in. We see his grace in lots of places. There's a lot of good things we can listen to and consume that are right and proper and appropriate and helpful and life-giving. But also, it's a broken, fallen world. There's a lot of evil in the world. There's a lot of wickedness in the world. There's a lot of selfishness in the world. And so, just like Egypt is this mix of good and evil, I think it helps us to kind of reflect on and see the world in this same light. And in Jesus' birth narrative and in the history of Israel, God called them out of Egypt. And so I wonder, it's got me thinking, is there a way that God is calling you and me out of Egypt as well? One of the things that Jesus talks about, it's in John 17. He's praying, it's this great prayer in John 17, and he's praying to God the Father, and he's praying about his followers. So people like you and me, if you're a follower of Jesus. And Jesus prays to the Father, and he says, I don't want you to take them out of the world, but I want you to protect them from the evil in the world. And then he says this, they are no more part of the world than I am part of the world. It's where we get this phrase, be in the world, but not of the world. In many ways, we're called out of being of the world, the ways that Egypt sort of pulls us in. Which got me thinking a little further, and be careful when you start to think. I'm going to point to something that's really obvious to all of us, but you don't want me to point it out. And the younger you are, you really don't want me to point it out. Because at this moment in history, I think that Egypt sucks most of us in most of the time through our screens. Doesn't mean it's all bad. A lot of good stuff in there. I'm picking up a lot of 49-year-old habits by looking at my screen. But there's also a lot of stuff that just sucks us in, right? Sucks us right into the world. And sometimes the content that we consume begins to consume us. So as we're thinking about this, one of the questions that I think arises is, are you consuming your content, or is your content consuming you? Not all bad, but it sucks us in. I saw a statistic recently that some segment of Gen Z spends on average 7 hours a day looking at a screen. And I'm not picking on you, just Gen Z, because it's true of all of our generations. We're all on the screens a lot. And I think it's one of the ways that Egypt sucks us in. And I wonder if you and I might need to hear this call to come out of Egypt. Even just for a few minutes a day, to turn down the noise, to be able to listen, and to connect to the bigger story that God is writing if you are a Christian, if you are a child of God. It should not be that our content consumes us to the point that there's no room for us to stop and listen and reflect on the bigger story, the most important story that you and I are a part of. Is God calling you to come out of Egypt, even just for a few minutes a day? So this is the call. Jesus is the firstborn son. He's called out of Egypt. And then Matthew tells us that all of this is a fulfillment of what was spoken by the prophet Hosea. And so biblical fulfillment is happening here. What does that mean? So when we think about prophecies being fulfilled, mostly we think of a prediction coming true, right? So like something is prophesied, and then when it actually happens, it's been fulfilled. And that's part of it. That is part of what biblical fulfillment is. But very often, like in this case, a fulfillment is a filling full. So if you got to turn that word around, when God's purposes and plans that have begun and have shown up in history in one way get filled more full or filled up more completely, that's a fulfillment. And we see this in so many ways that patterns happen, like Israel, and then in Jesus' life. What happened to Jesus is a filling full or a filling up of what God was doing in the nation of Israel. And so that's what's happening here. Matthew is pointing us to a place where God's plans, the story that he's writing, is being filled up in Jesus. And this shows up in some particular ways. Jesus fills up Israel's calling as representatives of God. So Israel was called to bring the love of God to all the nations. They would be blessed through him. And Jesus did that. Jesus is the perfect representative of God the Father on earth, bringing his love not just to Israel, but to people of every nation, including you and me. Jesus is doing that. He's filling up God's story through Israel. He's also filling up Moses' calling as the prophet of God. So in all these connections between Jesus and Israel, it's all intertwined with connections between Jesus and Moses, who was the leader of Israel. And we get some of this context as you read a little bit further in Hosea 11. Now, what Matthew does and what the biblical writers in the New Testament often do, they'll quote one verse out of a prophecy, but that verse is connected to the larger theme of that prophecy as well. So I'm going to go back to the part that Matthew quoted and look at what happens in the very next verse. Hosea 11, 1 and 2. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. That's the quote. But the next verse, but the more they were called, the more they went away from me. The way this looked in history is God delivered the Israelites out of Egypt, and then he spoke to them through Moses, gave them his law. But they didn't listen to Moses. And there's so much of that in Israel's history. God speaks and speaks and speaks through his prophet, and they did not listen, did not listen, did not listen. So much so that we read in Deuteronomy 18 this word that God spoke through Moses. He said, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites, and you must listen to him. So the Israelites weren't listening to Moses, but God promised that another prophet would come, and he is the one that they must listen to. And in the New Testament, especially in the book of Acts, you get the Apostle Peter, you get Luke, who wrote Luke and Acts. He was a companion of Paul on his journeys. You get Stephen, who was one of the early deacons in the New Testament church, all of them in different ways pointing to Jesus as the new Moses. He's the fulfillment of that prophecy. Jesus is filling up the role of Moses as the leader and spokesperson for God of his people. But don't take their word for it. Where Matthew takes us is to chapter 17, and there's this climactic moment where Jesus goes up on a mountain with his inner circle of disciples, and he was speaking to them. And we hear this in Matthew 17:5. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." So what Matthew has done, in Matthew chapter 2, in the birth narrative of Jesus, he's introduced this role of Jesus as his son. And he's led us to a place where because Jesus is the Son, and he is the filling up of God's ministry of speaking to his people, then God says, "This is my Son," and the command is, listen to him. And this is part of the bigger story that God is writing. God speaks to his people through his firstborn Son. And then the very clear invitation for you and me is to listen. That's why we got to get out of our content enough that it's not totally consuming us, so that we have time to listen. Because here's the point that he's making. Jesus, the Son, is the one we must listen to. Like if you're a Christian, If you're a part of God's story, if you're a follower of Jesus, then you've got to make time to listen to the one that God has sent. And it's Jesus, his firstborn son. So I'll ask again, what are you listening to? Are you making time? We talk about taking time to pray, not just at church, but in our daily lives. Are you taking time to listen to Jesus so that you can be shaped by that story? Because the fact is, the stories that are most important to us, those are the ones we make time to connect with and listen to. And there's a lot of good stories out there, but the most important story that we have to connect to is what God is doing in the world. And so are you taking time to listen to Jesus, the Son, among the stories of your life? And then this leads us to the third way that God works in his bigger story that I think we see in the birth narrative of Jesus. Not only does God protect his children by leading them to places of safety, and we can see that story happening in our lives. Do you believe that he is at work protecting you? Not only does God speak to his children through his firstborn son, we know that he is speaking through Jesus, through the Bible, through relationships with others, through prayer and reflection and meditation. He is speaking to us, and we can connect to that story. But thirdly, God comforts his children by giving them hope. He comforts his children by giving them hope. And this shows up in a story in maybe an unexpected way. So the final scene of this part of the story is this. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. And so what is unique, tragically, in the birth story of Jesus is that in an attempt to snuff out Jesus, we see this death sentence from Herod that all of the boys in Bethlehem, 2 years old and under, would be killed. Now, Bethlehem was a small town with a small population. Historians would say this might have been 15 to 20 boys that would have fit in that description there in Bethlehem. But every life is precious to God. And just because this was a small handful of boys in a small backwater town in Israel, these moms wept, and they wept bitterly. And this connection recalls something that God had done in the past. When he delivered Moses after a similar death sentence from Pharaoh. One more connection of how God works, protecting his children. But these women of Bethlehem, they wept. And then Matthew calls our attention to yet another fulfillment of prophecy. This time it's from Jeremiah. And in Jeremiah, we read of the women of Ramah, which is another town. If this is Jerusalem, and Bethlehem's about 5 miles south, the town of Ramah is north of Jerusalem, about 5 miles. And it would have been through that path that another moment in Israel's history, the exile, the people who were pulled out of their homeland in Israel, when Babylon came along, conquered them, and took these young men away, they would have come through Ramah. And Jeremiah talks about this time where the women of Ramah wept bitterly because their sons were being hauled off by Babylon to some unknown country far to the east, surely never to be seen or heard from again. And so in Israel's history, there was this moment. And Jeremiah characterizes it as Rachel weeping for her children. Rachel was the mother of Joseph and Benjamin, 2 of the 12 brothers who became the 12 tribes of Israel. So she's like this matriarchal figure in Israel's history. And so this great weeping went up. The women, the moms of Israel, wept bitterly. They grieved and mourned as their sons were being taken off into captivity. And here in Bethlehem, as their 2-year-old and younger boys were killed by this sentence of Herod. It was a time of grief and mourning that was deep. but it was not without hope. And just like there was more to the story in Hosea's prophecy, there's also more to the story in Jeremiah's prophecy. Because after the women of Ramah wept for their boys, wept for their children, the prophet Jeremiah goes on to point to hope. He says, one day the people are going to return, which they did. 70 years later, they returned back to Israel, and it gave hope. Even if they had lost their children, which is a tragedy, there was ultimate hope that was going to come out of it. And the same is true in the story of Jesus. Because Jesus, the promised Messiah, who was to deliver God's people, he had escaped. He had escaped to Egypt. And he is the one that the prophet Jeremiah talked about, through whom God would give his spirit to his people. There was ultimate hope that would come through the Messiah. So even in the grief and mourning that we see in this scene, there's a ray of hope that this fulfillment of prophecy points us to. And it doesn't dismiss the grief and sorrow and mourning and pain of this world. We live in Egypt, where there is a mix of good and evil, joy and sorrow. But in all of it, there's hope. For some of us, I imagine that's where we need to connect to the bigger story today. If you're in a place where you're struggling to find hope, you're struggling to see how God can be at work protecting you or speaking to you or comforting you, there is hope when we connect to this bigger story of what God is doing. And how do we connect to that bigger story? We listen. We listen to Jesus. How do we do that? Well, individually, we carve out time in the content of our lives to read the Bible, to pray, to reflect, to meditate on what he is saying to us through his word. We also talk about finding your people, finding your place, connecting with people in the church where we're learning from each other and hearing from Jesus through the relationships that we have with one another, and expanding our impact through being used by Jesus for his purposes. All these are ways of leaning in and listening and connecting to the bigger story that brings us protection, speaks to us, and ultimately gives us hope. Jesus the Son is the one we're called to listen to. Would you bow your heads with me for just a moment? I want to lead us in just a brief time of listening to hear what Jesus might be saying to you and me as the firstborn son of God. And if you're here and you've never listened to Jesus before, you've never asked for forgiveness of your sins and turned toward following after him, that's my invitation to you, to begin to listen, to lean in, find his forgiveness and his spirit. And if you do that, you can do it today. You can do it in your own home. You can call out to him. Begin a life of listening and connecting to his story. If you do that, share it with someone that you know and trust that can help you take steps of listening and following further. For all of us, I wonder how you and I might be called today, this week, this Christmas season, this upcoming year, to come out of Egypt. How is God calling you to come out of Egypt enough to hear him speak? Enough to have your ears and heart and mind attuned to listening to what he would have to say to you, so that you might receive the protection and comfort and guidance that he provides, but that it wouldn't stop with you, that he could flow through you. Because part of the good news of the gospel is that when Jesus' Spirit comes to live inside of us, then he begins to fill up his purposes of representing God in the world through us. And you and I can step into that calling as representatives and heirs of all that God is doing, both in us and through us. And that's what brings us hope. And that's how you and I can bring hope to an Egypt in the world around us. In a moment, we're going to stand and sing, but I want to give you just a brief time to take time to pray. What is God saying to you? And then I'll invite us to stand and sing in just a moment. This prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for the story of Jesus that connects us to the bigger story that you are doing. Help us to listen. Help us to learn.